I'm a professor, a full-time scientist. That is all I do here. I rarely teach. I'm basically 100% trying to do research. That's what our lab is about. We focus primarily on ME/CFS. That's where most of our funding is centered. Our second focus area is fibromyalgia, and our third is Gulf War illness. So those are the three that we spend most of our time on. So ultimate goal, real quick before I start getting into the data, the ultimate goal is to develop the absolute best treatments possible for ME/CFS. It is a shame, as I'm sure everyone knows, that there are no FDA approved treatments for ME/CFS. And more so, I checked up to date this morning, and up to date is kind of the physician's Bible right now. So if a primary care physician had an ME/CFS participant or a patient and they wanted to see what to do, they would go to up to date and look at the recommendations. And I just checked that again this morning, and the recommendations have no treatments whatsoever recommended for ME/CFS. There's no guidance for ME/CFS. What it does have is treat the symptoms. It's like if your ME/CFS patient has sleep, try to take care of sleep. If they have cognitive issues, send them to a neuropsychologist. If they have just fatigue, try a stimulant or try exercise. Nothing is actually targeting ME/CFS. And so, that's not a critique of up to date, and that's not a critique of the medical community. It's just the fact that there has been no treatment that's gotten enough results to be recommended. So there's really nothing that's met that bar, and that's why there are no specific treatments offered by the physician's handbook. So we have to get treatments in the hands of clinicians, and particularly we have to get treatments in the hand of primary care physicians because there's not enough specialists that deal with this. So that's what I'm trying to do, treatments that can be used by any physician, any clinician to solve this. So that's the goal. I'm not going to go into the specifics of what I think is wrong. I'm just going to give a really quick, maybe 40-second overview so we're all on the same page. And the quick story behind everything I'm presenting today is individuals with ME/CFS have low-level inflammation, low-level chronic inflammation in the brain. That's the quick story. And I call it low-level because it's not immediately threatening to your life. There are levels of brain inflammation that are deadly and could kill someone in a few days. Bacterial meningitis is a really good example of brain inflammation that is very, very dangerous. And so I do think ME/CFS is low level, but that's just to distinguish it from a acute medical emergency. But in terms of disrupting life, even though I call it low level inflammation, it still causes significant and catastrophic effects on fatigue and cognitive disruption and malaise. So let me tell you why I got so obsessed with seeing ME/CFS. This right here is the real reason why I focused on this for now. Probably the past 7 years, I've been doing a lot of imaging. And this is why, when I started fibromyalgia and ME/CFS about 12 years ago, I very quickly went to clinical trials. I did some initial projects to confirm to me that it was brain inflammation. And then I wanted to go straight to clinical trials. And it's because I thought I had a good hypothesis. I had a strong suspicion that ME/CFS was a brain inflammation disorder. What we need are these centrally active anti-inflammatories. So let's just go. Let's run the clinical trials. The problem I ran into when I tried to get funding to run the clinical trials, I hit these brick walls. And what happened was I could get pilot funding from nonprofit organizations who were very generous in funding these ideas. For example, if you hear of low-dose naltrexone, that's probably because I was able to get pilot funding to test it primarily in fibromyalgia. So that was incredible. The problem is there was no path to develop it and test it in larger groups after that nonprofit kind of proof of concept funding. And so the trials never went anywhere. And it was because I couldn't get the large $1 to $2 million, $3 million grants to run it in a large enough group to actually affect prescribing behavior from physicians. And the same reason came up every single time. It was when I tried to submit a grant, they would say, this idea is really cool. We can see that this low-dose naltrexone you're testing works. All that's good, but we want to see why it works. We want to know, we want you to show us that there's neuroinflammation and when you give this drug, you're reducing the neuroinflammation. We want to see that before we commit millions of dollars into testing this in large groups. And I understand that there's nothing nefarious about that request. It's just the fact that 90% of clinical trials fail in humans across different fields. That means if you run 100 clinical trials, 90 of those will fail. And that's a whole lot of wasted money. And so huge federal organizations like NIH are wary of giving lots of money to these clinical trials. And so it's very hard to get NIH funding, and it's just a lot of money. It's the same thing with corporations. They're very reluctant to put in large amounts of money. They just want to see what's going on. So that was the biggest barrier. The nonprofits like SolveME would take the chance with small pilot funding, but you needed groups to handle the kind of the big lifting to do the large clinical trials. What I think are the urgent funding needs, we have to keep all the mechanistic stuff that's going on. We should continue it, but as you hear me saying, we need to add a lot of clinical trials on top of that. I think we need to adopt that kind of approach with the long COVID community and just identify, prioritize, and start testing these clinical trials, testing these treatments. What you generally need are pilot funds of about 25,000 to 50,000. That's to test it on a small group, just to see if there's promise, if there's any signal there. And then after that, you need kind of mid-level funding around 200,000, 300,000 to test it on a slightly larger group. And if those both look good, you can go into a full clinical trial that could be 1.5 million or 2, and that would be the large size clinical trial that can influence prescribing behavior and actually get it into the hands of patients. And so I think we need funding for all of those, and that's not all for industry to do. Some of that I think is the role of federal governments, but we need to work on making sure that we can do clinical trials for CFS through NIH, for example, as well. And then the last thing I want to mention is I think if we really want to do this in the most efficient way, I would love to see a dedicated clinical trial center for CFS, where that is all they do, and it is the experts in running clinical trials, because most researchers are not clinical trialists. And so they may have a good idea of a treatment, but they don't run human clinical trials. And I really think we need a center ultimately that would do this day after day, that can run 10 plus clinical trials at once, run it quickly and say, nope, that didn't work. Nope, that didn't work, but this one did. And then we can take that forward. And those would probably cost about 4 million probably to get going. So it's a lot of money, but given the scope of the problem and money given in other areas, it's not that much to actually get something like this started. Last thing is how you can help. I think the general ways of spreading the news and getting other people invested. I just want to mention that the nonprofit funding is critically important. For a researcher, the main reason is that nonprofits are willing to fund the novel, risky new ideas that the more established federal government, huge things, billions of dollars, they're usually not willing to take that chance. They want to see preliminary data. And just like how I turned the Ramsey grant into a large NIH grant, it's the nonprofits that give that initial funds to test it out, and then you can get larger NIH funding after you've generated that pilot stuff. So I do want to mention that. I do want to say really quickly, if you can participate in ME/CFS research of any type, also clinical trials, if there's one around you and you can participate, that is what a lot of this work is driven by.